Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm back, as you can see. I won't lie, I thought it was by popular demand, and then I realized I was already scheduled. So here we are, and I'm about to start our cruise down the east coast of Australia. And there's a couple of fun facts here. Australia is the only place on Earth that's an island, a country, and a continent. And this island, country, continent has 6 states, just very briefly. There's 6 of those states, and there's 2 what we call territories. One is the Australian Capital Territory down here, which is where the capital of Australia is Canberra. It's so important, it's not even shown on this map. And then we have the Northern Territory up the north, and that's where we're heading for first in Darwin. So welcome to the land at the bottom of the world, often known as the land down under. Yes, it does come up with a caution of sorts. So here's a few fun facts about Australia. Now, when I do my first lecture, I usually gauge a little bit what you guys find funny, and I think I've got your number okay. So I've lived in a few countries around the world. I've lived in Hong Kong, I've lived in Shanghai, in the land of Brexit, where I come from, or commonly known as Britain. And I have to say, Australia is one of the most laid-back, if not the most laid-back country I've ever lived in. Now, we don't really care too much about being politically correct all the time. We don't worry about being politically correct at any point in time. Now, I do realize there are quite a lot of Aussies in the audience. May not agree, but I'm the one doing the lecture, and that's just how it works. Okay, so it's a very liberating country that tells it like it is, and this was a very popular advert we had to counterattack drinking recently. It seemed to work. We call a spade, or sometimes we call it a shovel, but it's the same thing. So Australians or Aussies have a very healthy, out there sense of humour, and if you have a look at this one down here, their sense of humour kind of depends on which part of the country you actually come from. If you live in the very dry heart of Australia, then this is the sense of humour. Don't even start me on Tasmanians' take on what Australia is like. They see it from a different perspective altogether. And the mainlanders have their own view of the good folks in Tasmania. Now, the Tasmanians buy into this as well. So we sort of say they have 2 heads down there, but they buy into that joke as well as do. So we're heading for Darwin up here, and they have their own particular sense of humour in this one as well. I mean, where else could you get hit in the head with a flying dildo at a wedding? So this is about the folks, you've maybe got an idea now about where we're going. This is a country of abbreviations. Nothing is pronounced the way it's written. And there's nothing you can do about this. You're just going to have to do the best you can to try and figure out what everybody's talking about. This land of abbreviations is also home to some adorable, cute and cuddlies, like the koalas. They seem to spend the majority of their time sleeping in the forks in the trees. They are, in fact, zonked out of their minds or high as kites. It's from the eucalyptus oil that they drink throughout the day. But whatever you do, never ever call them koala bears. This will upset the koalas. It will also upset the Aussies. They do not belong to the bear family. They are koalas. And then we have our other local wildlife, our friendly kangaroos. They have their moments as well. They can be quite vicious out there. But during this cruise, you'll have an opportunity to meet some of these cute and cuddlies and the not so cute and cuddlies in our upcoming ports. And including the ones at the top of the food chain, the crocodiles. They come in different shapes and sizes. Darwin is a good place to see them. And then a bit further down the food chain are the beautiful blue-ringed octopus that will take you out with just one bite. They are deadly. But there's more heaps of wildlife that will try to kill you in horrific ways down here. And so all I can say to you is enjoy your stay in Australia. It's this land of great distances. If you were to drive from Sydney to Darwin, it would take you nearly 2 days, assuming you didn't stop for breaks. But I don't think anybody in their right mind these days would do that. But if you were considering driving from Sydney to Darwin, some things to keep in mind. And they say a picture speaks 1,000 words, just to give you an idea. In case you missed the first one, here's a simplified version of it. And yes, we do have camels in Australia, in the land down under. They were brought into Australia in the 19th century as transportation for goods through the harsh, arid centre of Australia up and down the country. Cameleers were brought from Afghanistan to look after these camels, and up until that point. And then the railway was eventually built from Sydney. Initially, it went to Alice Springs. Now it goes all the way up to Darwin. And the train or the railway replaced the need for camels, and they were simply released into the Australian desert. They adapted extremely well to the arid conditions, and they've sort of been living the dream ever since. Australia now has the largest population of feral camels in the world. The overland train that replaced the camels is known as the GAN, another abbreviation, an abbreviation of the name Afghan Cameleers, and that's quite a famous train. It takes about 54 hours to cover nearly 3,000 kilometres from Sydney to Darwin. It takes you through the red centre of Australia. It's used mainly by tourists. Locals prefer to take a 4-hour flight with Jetstar, which is a fraction of the cost. All the way up. Australia's been immortalised in some classic films I'm sure you're all familiar with over the years, creating some very famous, memorable one-liners that live on today. And I read at a restaurant in Sydney, was recently sued for having this slogan here on their steak knives. That's not a knife, that's a knife. But this apparently has been copyright. There's a hilarious classic tongue-in-cheek Priscilla, Queen of the Desert, which recently been made into a musical. And on a more serious note, there's the rabbit-proof fence, based on a true story, of original woman Molly Craig, one of the many Aboriginal children forcibly taken from their parents way back when to be fostered to white families in order to be de-Aboriginalised, and this was known as the Stolen Generation. This film is about Molly walking 1,500 miles back home as a child, following that rabbit-proof fence. So if you're interested in that, it's a good movie to sort of get out on DVD. Darwin has 2 seasons like everyone else around here, the wet and the dry. The wet season's from December to March, though the wet season seems to be a little bit late in coming to the region this year, which you may have heard as we came through Benoa and also Komodo. Anyhow, the wet season is the monsoon rains, brings the monsoon rains and the tropical cyclones. And Darwin sits in one of the most lightning-prone areas in the world. During the wet season, thunderstorms are quite common late in the afternoon. And on 31st of January 2002, an early morning squall line produced over 5,000 cloud-to-ground lightning strikes within 60 kilometres radius of Darwin. Not dangerous, but when the rain stops and the sun comes out, that's when the humidity level soars. And all of us ladies all know how this plays havoc with our hair, and my hair's not been the same since Komodo. So a little bit of history behind what makes Darwin tick. Aborigines have lived in Australia for about 30,000 years, or give or take. And though their predecessors came to Australia from other parts of Asia, today it's considered as being Aborigines are the original owners, the landowners here. Today, almost 30% of the Northern Territory's population is Aboriginal. And Darwin is one of the only cities in Australia where Aborigines have integrated into the community, and it's probably one of the only cities that you will actually see Aborigines as part of the community. They are nomadic. They live and travel in the interior. True Aborigines are nomadic. They live and travel in the interior in tribes, doing what they call going walkabout. So every so often they uproot and they move somewhere else. They don't have a written language, so they pass their history down through the generations, telling the story of the Aboriginal dream time, or the beginning of time according to the Aboriginal story. With no written language, their story is told in tribal dances, known as corroborees, and in some history are found in the rock paintings that you'll find throughout Australia, predominantly in the centre, which is a much simpler way than trying to put this very complex story down onto paper. In Aboriginal culture, there's no concept of ownership. Nobody owns anything. Everything belongs to everybody. And so for this reason, even the land which belongs to nobody, it belongs to everybody. Each generation simply takes care of it for the next generation. So for this reason, there's no word for thank you in Aboriginal language, because you don't really need to thank anybody for anything. Everything is communal. And however, there is a wee bit of double standards creeping in here and there, mainly everywhere, with about 50% of the land in the Northern Territory now being claimed as sacred Aboriginal land belonging to the Aborigines. and you now require a permit to get onto this land. So that concept of the land belonging to nobody and everybody has a little bit of caveats here and there. Some of our iconic tourist sites have been renamed to Aboriginal names. The Olgas are now known as Kata Tjuta, and the most recognised monolith on the planet, clearly Ayers Rock, named after a guy called Ayers who discovered it, is now known as Uluru. We haven't got round to renaming Sydney yet, so I'm assuming it's still Sydney when we get back there. But fast forwarding a century, 2 or maybe even 6, to the 16th century, when Australia's real recorded modern history started, because up to that point, there's no written history, there's no Aboriginal language, so nobody knows really what was going on in the country, probably not that much really, until the Europeans arrived. And this was a time when practically every civilized country in Europe was sending explorers out to this part of the world in search of the elusive great southern continent. Everybody suspected that it existed. Try as they might, nobody could actually find it. And these early explorers headed off in small ships into the great unknown, not entirely sure what was out there or whether they were going to make it back home again anyways. But I take my hat off to every single one of these guys. I mean, I don't even go to Aldi's, my local store, without Google Maps. And if I'm doing a long journey, just to be on the safe side, I take a GPS with me. But these guys came out here not really knowing where they were going. And in the early 1600s, Portuguese explorer Pedro Fernandes de Quiro, he was convinced he had found the great southern land. And he called it Terra Australis del Espiritu Santi, and that was that. Nobody challenged this. I mean, why would they? Until about 160 years later, when the French explorer Bougainville arrived out here to sort of check it out for himself. And he immediately sensed that something was wrong when he found himself sailing between two lands where there shouldn't have been a gap if this was the big continent. It turned out that Pedro hadn't actually discovered Australia. He had discovered the South Pacific islands of Vanuatu. But the first known sighting of Australia was by the Dutch navigator William Jensen in the 1600s. The Dutch named the land New Holland, or Nouvelle Holland, but they didn't appear to feel any need to actually settle there. So that was it, they named it and took off. And then almost every man and his dog, as we would say, jumped onto the bandwagon over the next few centuries. Until 1839, Lieutenant John Stokes sailed into what is now Darwin Harbour, on board HMS Beagle. He named it Darwin after his former shipmate, British evolutionist Charles Darwin. And contrary to rumours, Charles Darwin himself never actually visited the area. It was just named after him. But Australia was still completely isolated from the rest of the world, and some might say still is. But in the 1800s, it was decided to connect Australia with England via a submarine cable that was pulled ashore at Darwin. Then the cable was run south, overland, to connect with the cable coming up north from Adelaide. And the two ends were connected on the 3rd of January, 1872. And so only 2 years after the project was started, Australia had its first rapid communication link to the rest of the world and pretty much gave Darwin a purpose for existing. The two ends of the cable were joined at a place called Daly Waters, about 600 kilometres south of Darwin. But mention the name Daly Waters to some people, and you might hear the sound of banjos twanging in the background here. Daly Waters is home to the infamous Daly Waters pub that's been here since the beginning of time itself. And it can only be described as being like something out of Deliverance. When they ran out of space on the walls to pin up old banknotes, the men began donating their thongs. Now, a thong in Australia is a rubber flip-flop sandal. So they began donating their thongs, and then the ladies began donating their own items of more intimate apparel. And if any Aussies in the audience been up here when you were doing the overland, you might recognise some of your own stuff up there. Australia became a federation in 1901, and whilst part of the Commonwealth, or whilst still part of the Commonwealth, it opened its own its first parliament in the presence of the Duke and Duchess of Cornwall and York later that year. Darwin didn't entirely escape World War II when it was bombed by the Japanese. The raids damaged the city during the 64 bombing strikes, although most of the damage was downplayed at the time, and there's a lecture after mine. You should please make sure you stick around on the actual bombing of Darwin. But to avoid affecting Australia's morale, the whole incident was kind of played down a bit. But when the bombs hit the oil storage tanks down at the harbour, the fear of a full-scale Japanese attack became a very real concern. And there's a series of underground oil storage tunnels were built into the hillside down at the harbour to protect the precious fuel and oil supplies from any further aerial bombardment. They're no longer used for storage, but they're kept there like a sort of museum. And they're quite important or interesting for the significance of Darwin's association with the war. Tunnels number 5 and 6 are open to the public within walking distance from where we will dock, and I'll tell you in just a moment. But after the bombing of Darwin, the bombing of Darwin is heavily featured in another Australian film called Australia with Nicole Kidman and Hugh Jackman. The Hollywood version is a bit thin on fact, but the scenery alone in that film, where it was filmed at the top end of Australia, is quite stunning. The Japanese bombing of Darwin had been a serious wake-up call for Australia. The rate of population growth simply wasn't felt to be enough to defend the country properly. So a massive immigration program was launched, targeting mainly British immigrants. For a sum of £10, you could take your family out to Australia. And hence the £10 POM came into being. POMs being the English, not so much the Scottish, I got to add. But you could get a one-way ticket provided you stayed here for 3 years. Immigration was open to Brits and European immigrants only because Australia had a white policy at the time. And my family came out here on Fair Star, and if you're in the Australians here, it was run by Sitmar, and this was my first ship when I first went to sea as purser, way back in 1973 or thereabouts. Darwin sits in an area of seasonal cyclones. One in particular had a devastating effect when Cyclone Tracy roared into town on Christmas Eve in 1974. The eye of the cyclone passed right over Darwin, and the city took the full brunt of Tracy's fury. Wind speeds were reported at about 260 kilometres, and then they stopped registering. Only 400 of its 11,000 homes were left standing, and 50 persons were reported as having lost their lives, although the later figure was reported being a lot higher than that. So an hour of nature's wrath succeeded in doing what 64 Japanese bombing raids didn't. It devastated Darwin. It wiped Darwin out. So by the morning, Christmas morning 1974, Darwin had effectively ceased to exist. And with the city in ruins, the majority of Darwin's population was airlifted south in what was the biggest evacuation in Australia's history. The city began the slow process of rebuilding, and large quantities of materials and manpower had to be brought up from the south, and it was thirsty work rebuilding Darwin. And the work sites ended up with quite a lot of empty beer cans chucked all over the place. This was the days before conservation. Nobody really knew what to do with them until somebody came up with quite a bright idea. Why not put these empty beer cans to good use, build some boats and hold a regatta? You might get some ideas on here for your boat building later in the cruise. And so the legendary beer can regatta was born, and it's been running every year since. There are no rules. Pretty much anything goes as long as they're made of beer cans. And some of the competitors go above and beyond, helping to provide the empty beer cans for the race. Now, in the 1980s and almost at the end of the history, you could camp right up almost under Ayers Rock itself. That's since changed with Aboriginal rezoning of the land. But in 1982, this campsite became the flashpoint for one of Australia's most famous legal trials. It was here in 1982 that Lindy Chamberlain's baby was reported by Lindy as the baby as having been taken from the tent by a dingo. And this sparked a humongous trial, and it split the country in half. Who immediately thought she was guilty? He didn't think she was guilty. She was found guilty of murder and jailed, but eventually pardoned. but this event seems to live on in the memories of Aussies when you mention that area. Climbing Ayers Rock was almost a passage of rites for tourists visiting the rock. That all ceased to be about 2 months ago, when the Aboriginal community permanently closed Ayers Rock to walkers on the 29th of October this year. So if you were thinking of going back to climb the rock, sorry. Then in June this year, Darwin was rattled by a 5.7 earthquake, very, very unusual. It originated in the Banda Sea off Indonesia. There was no damage, but it sort of shook the residents up a little bit. So that's it for the history of Darwin. And it's welcome to Darwin. We are going to dock in the small harbour there at Fort Hill Wharf, where I put the ship on there. The other side of the harbour here is called Stokes Hill Wharf, so make sure you come back to the right wharf. It's a long walk round there. But I'll tell you why I mentioned Stokes Hill Wharf in just a moment. This part of Australia, particularly Northern Territory, experiences huge tidal variations. And Darwin has a tidal range of nearly 7 metres. That's 21 feet. So, which will become rather obvious during the day, affecting the angle of the ship, perhaps not so much on this one, but on one of these big mega ships, it's a significant change in angle. So if you come back and you can't see the ship, the chances are we haven't sailed. The tide's just dropped by about 21 feet, so the ship's gone down with it. So there you go. You exit the port via this covered walkway. It takes you into the passenger terminal. Inside, there's a good selection, ladies, of little shops selling typical Aussie souvenirs, lots of things you didn't realise you needed till you saw them. There's always a good selection of leather crocodile bags and wallets, Aboriginal crafts, baskets, paintings, stray opals, pearls, whatever. Now, guys, you might like to head back on board at this point, because I have always found that shopping with my partner is like hunting with the game warden. There's absolutely no fun in it at all. Now, one thing I'm going to say to you, one thing you really need to buy up here is a fan. It's going to be the best purchase you ever made when you're sitting in the tour buses. So see if you can pick one up in Darwin somewhere along that. Those of you going on tour and the comfortable transport, that will be waiting out the front of the terminal for you. Those of you not going on tour, you have 3 options of getting into town: taxi, shuttle bus, or on foot. You really don't need a taxi. Shuttle bus will leave from outside the terminal, and it's about a 10 minutes drive into town, and they will run quite regularly. Shuttle bus is going to drop you at the Tourist Information Centre right in town. If you don't want to wait for the next shuttle bus, you can actually walk into town along this fairly new boardwalk that starts just to the left, just to the right from when you exit the terminal building. Now, it's not a long walk. It's since been covered in. It's not covered at that point, but they have since covered it in with a canopy. Halfway along, there's a sign pointing to the town. You just go left. As I say, it's been covered in recently. And then you just follow this round past. There's an artificial beach and there's a lagoon, because nobody swims in the water up here, crocodiles and things. So there's an artificial beach and a lagoon. And then you come to a lift, and that will take you up to this walkway. That will take you across the road. And when you come out that walkway, you're at the bottom of town. Maybe take you 20 minutes. It's hot, so think twice about whether this is what you want to do, but it's quicker than sometimes waiting for the shuttles. When you come out of here, where I took this picture, if you turn to your left and just walk along here a little bit, you'll come to Survivors Lookout with views over the harbour. But it was from up here that they watched the bombing of Darwin playing out in 1942. And there's some panels along there with a little bit of the story behind that. And there's also a memorial to the bombing of Darwin up here too. Now, when you come out of that building, you walk straight ahead. Instead of going to the left there, you come across to the small Church of Christ. This is one of Darwin's most photographed attractions. It was an hour after the midnight service ended here on Christmas Eve, 1974, that Cyclone Tracy roared into town. The church was completely destroyed, leaving only the small brick porch at the front there with the original vestry and hymn cupboard. Some of the original stones were salvaged to use to build a new church on the site, but they have built it behind the original brick porch, and that's been incorporated into the design. It's just a standalone in the front. Further up the street, if you walk straight ahead, you're almost in town now. There's another set of ruins of what was Darwin's town hall, built in the 1800s. That was another victim of the Cyclone Tracy. They've left the ruins the way they are. It's the second most photographed attraction in town. And then you're almost in Smith Street Pedestrian Mall, which is the heart of the CBD, or retail section. I did a whole series of lectures one time in Asia using the word CBD, and someone asked me in the last day what it meant. Central Business District, in case you're not familiar. So that'll take you into the CBD. Lots of shops, coffee lounges, small restaurants in here. And this is where the shuttle bus will drop you, almost round the corner from that mall. Fairly much in the centre of town is Darwin's Crocosaurus Cove, what's known as Crocosaurus Cove. It's a great place to get up close and personal with some Aussie crocs, another abbreviation. There's a couple of options on how you can do this. You can hand feed them at the end of a stick, a very long stick, I got to add. Or for the bigger adrenaline rush, there is the cage of death. You're lowered into a pool inside that's home to a massive crocodile. That's the purpose, which looks fairly secure from where I'm standing. But when some of the thrill seekers complained that the crocs weren't being as active as they had hoped for, when they were in the glass tube, the management now feeds the crocs while you're in the pool, making it all that more realistic, and that certainly livened things up a little bit. And I'm guessing that the scratch marks are on the inside of that perspex. So that's Crocosaurus Cove. There's a small church here that I'll mention. St. Mary's Star of the Sea. It's built from the white stone cut from the cliffs of Darwin Harbour, but it's famous for this painting of the Black Madonna. It's the Virgin Mary and the Child painted as Australian Aborigines. But during World War II, the church was the seat of the army garrison, and the military chaplaincy for Australian troops up in the city there. Now, most of what I've mentioned just now, there is the Botanic Gardens and one thing and another, but I haven't mentioned Botanic Gardens. I'm not sure how many people are going there, but I'll move on because there's some other stuff I want to mention which is outside. But everything I've mentioned is in downtown Darwin. So you see, it's not a big town. It's built in sort of grid, and it's very easy to get to, whether you take the shuttle or whether you walk in. And those oil tunnels that I mentioned are just there, almost opposite from where we dock. So here's a bird's eye view or a drone's eye view of where those tunnels are. If you're interested, they're just across there. They're not mind-shattering, but they are of significant historical importance. But from the tunnels, if you do walk there, you can actually walk into town without coming all the way back to the ship. There are steps near the tunnels which will take you up to Survivor's Lookout. It was missing the V, that I mentioned to you just a few minutes ago. There's a lot of steps. But they will take you out almost directly opposite that small Church of Christ that I mentioned to you a moment. There are a lot of steps, but alternatively, you could do it on reverse, coming back. If you're really keen to see those tunnels, you can walk down the steps and then back to the ship. Now, we are docked at Fort Hill Wharf, and the other one that I mentioned to you is Stokes Hill Wharf that I mentioned briefly. And this is one of Darwin's newest tourist attractions. It's on Stoke Hill Wharf over here. The only way to get from where we dock to Stoke Hills Wharf is to walk around that causeway. And instead of turning left to go into town, you just keep going, and it'll take you round to, all right, there you are, round to Stoke Hill Wharf. This is Darwin's newest attraction. It's the Royal Flying Doctor Service Museum. It was only opened at the end of 2017. As you know, the Royal Doctor Flying Service, is known as RFDS, was founded by the Reverend John Flynn in 1939 as an aeromedical operation in the Northern Territory, mainly as a medical service to patients living in remote outback areas of the Northern Territory where they had no doctors or no access to local hospitals. Patients are uplifted and they're monitored during the flights whilst being transported from wherever to hospitals in major cities. And this is an excellent little museum. And it is part of Australia, significant part of Australia, because it does a lot of good, and it's been going for years. It tells you about how it operates. Everything here is very well exhibited, and it's definitely worth doing. But the museum has a second exhibition on the bombing of Darwin during World War II, and this one has holograms telling the story of how it played out in Darwin with some very high-tech virtual reality that takes you right into the action. So it's an excellent little museum. If you have time on your hands, definitely go and do it. I couldn't get to it the last time I was up here. I was going on another tour, but it's on my bullet list for this time round. So the next few attractions, that's all within Darwin, within the city and nearby where we dock. The next few attractions are slightly out of the CBD. There are 3 attractions I'm going to mention up here in a suburb called Fanny Bay. The museum and the art gallery of the Northern Territory, it's sometimes just called Darwin Museum. The Fanny Bay Jail, or that one, and right at the far out here is East Point, is the East Point Military Museum. So starting with the museum, this one is also well worth doing. As well as a museum, it's also an art gallery with good display of local Aboriginal art as well as Aboriginal crafts from the Tiwi Islands as well as from around Australia. They have a big Cyclone Tracy exhibition. It's one of the 2 most visited exhibitions in the museum. Lots of photos and old footage taken during the cyclone. It was a big event in Darwin's history, and so it's quite a significant exhibition here. Lots of the original artifacts that were salvaged from it, of that cyclone that destroyed Darwin in 1974. And this is just another example of Australian humour, keep the driveway clear. The other most visited exhibit here is the preserved body of Sweetheart the crocodile. She weighed something like 700, nearly 800 kilos, and she was called Sweetheart because of her wide grin. But she was responsible for a series of attacks on local fishermen in these small fishing boats in the late 70s, 74, 79. So it was decided to capture her with the intention of relocating her further away and leaving the fishermen alone. But something went badly wrong. She died of dehydration on the way, and so they stuffed her instead, and they relocated her to the museum. So that's the second famous attraction in there. Actually, it's probably the most famous attraction in there. The Fanny Bay Jail operated as Her Majesty's Prison until until 1979. And today it's not a prison now, it's open to the public. The original cell blocks are there. You can also visit the gallows that were purposely built for the last execution held in 1952. The original lever that operates the trap is here, if that turns you on. And you can push it if you really want to get into the feel of things, or you can stand beneath the gallows and experience it from both angles. There's the wash house. This is the native section that was reserved for Aboriginal prisoners. So if you're interested in this type of thing, it's quite an interesting little prison to visit. There's a couple of kilometres further on from Fanny Bay is East Point Reserve. It was the last major fortress on Australian soil. It was from here that Australia prepared to fight the invasion that never really came, but they didn't know that at the time. And the Darwin Military Museum is located in this heritage-listed area here. They keep updating it, and I don't get the chance to go there every time I'm in Darwin, so maybe slightly different, but there's a collection of old historic artifacts in here, pieces of military equipment inside and outside. And this is the old number 2 gun turret, and the number 1, number 2. And apparently before the war, the turret was used as a hotspot for the locals, a sort of dance nightclub, if you like. It's quite a big turret. The exhibits are added to and change from time to time. And the museum is currently, I'm pretty sure it's still doing it, collecting artifacts from all conflicts where Australian troops were deployed. And the last time I was here, there was lots of old artillery just rusting away in peace out in the gardens. They may have moved it since then, but it's quite photogenic in its own way. But the most important section in a separate exhibition is the Defence of Darwin experience. This was only opened a few years ago on the 70th anniversary of the bombing of Darwin. There's lots of displays and video clips and one thing and another. It's compact inside, but it's a fair amount to keep you interested if you're interested in this side of Darwin's history, and bits and pieces inside and outside. Now here's something a little bit left of field if you happen to be out there. If you walk a few meters from the museum towards the shoreline, you'll come across these, they're quite colourful. They've lost the colour on this slide, with amazing colours in the rock. And you look right back over to the city of Darwin, but that's not why I'm telling you. There's a plaque set in the rock somewhere here to the famous or infamous Darwin Rock Sitters Club. And they were a group of die-hard journalists way back in 1970s who gathered at this spot every Saturday afternoon under the excuse of watching the brilliant sunsets that they get over the Arafura Sea. In actual fact, they had come here to sink a few tinnies, which is Australia speak for have a few beers. several beers for that matter. And as the tide came in, the rock would gradually become submerged that they were standing on. And the winner was the one who managed to sit on the rock, finishing his beer while he got completely submerged. There's a little plaque around there. So that's it for the roundabout. Now, getting around in and around the central part of Darwin, it has 2 hop-on, hop-off buses. This one's called the Tour Tub. I think it's the better of the two. It stops at several places, including the Fanny Bay Jail, the museum, the military museum, and a whole lot of other places as well. I can't say whether it comes down to the ship. I've seen it there, but I'm not sure. This is the second one. This one has a more rigid itinerary, and I don't think it fits in with our schedule quite as much. But the tour tub leaves from where the shuttle bus drops you at the information centre. Down the track is Darwin speak for a little bit further out of town. There's an aviation heritage centre here, if this turns you on. It's one of the major aviation centres in Australia. It always gets very good feedback. If you're interested in aviation and planes, there's an impressive display of aircraft from early pioneer days, like this Vickers Vimy that Captain Ross Smith and his crew landed at Fanny Bay back in 1919. I think they won a prize of $10,000 for having flown from England in just under 30 days. Of course, there's all sorts of other flying stuff in here as well. It's home to this massive, well, it has always been home to this B-52 bomber on permanent display or loan from the United States. And it's one of only 2 B-52s on public display outside the US. There's also video clips in here on the evacuation of Darwin after Cyclone Tracy, when Australia's airlines TAA, and anyone from Australia in the audience will remember that, TAA and Ansett, both were domestic airlines that both have since gone bankrupt. What I remember most about Ansett is losing millions of points when they did actually go bankrupt. But they played a very big part in the evacuation of Australians during that time. Now, even further down the track is a place called Humpty Doo. And that's usually included as a refreshment stop if you're on the route, the tour going to Adelaide River to see the famous jumping crocs. You could describe Humpty Doo as being a small hick town, because that's exactly what it is. But if you're interested in seeing the typical traditional kind of places out there, the Humpty Doo is a good place. I think some of the tours stop for refreshments at a typical bush hotel. I'm not sure if it's this one, but this is where men are men. And there's no question about that. So it'd be a lot of fun. Now, here's a bit of trivia. Not so long ago, somebody came across a 3-eyed snake in Humpty Doo, which made the local Humpty Doo news headlines. And an out-of-town journalist was sent up to cover the story. He reported it wasn't so much the discovery of a 3-eyed snake that amazed him. It was the fact that a place called Humpty Doo actually existed. So that's the famous Humpty. My cousin lived here when he lived in Australia, so I do know it exists. Now, after leaving Humpty Doo, the tours continue on to the Adelaide River to see the famous jumping crocodiles. So that's on a river boat, a chance to see this natural phenomenon. These crocodiles are not trained. This is not a zoo. These are in the wild sort of thing on the river. And this is how they catch their food naturally. They're not trained to do this for the tourists. But just in case they're not jumping naturally, when the tour boat arrives, sometimes the guides have been known to dangle bits of meat over the side, and that for sure will get the crocs jumping out of the water. Hopefully you get some really good shots, perhaps not quite as close, but that's a fun tour, and it's nice. You'll see a bit of the countryside going down there, as well as this natural phenomenon. Now, much further down the track, Darwin is gateway to the Litchfield National Park. It's also a gateway to the other national park called Kakadu. Now, if you ask the locals which they prefer, Litchfield or Kakadu, the local joke is they will tell you it's not Kakadu, it's Kakadont, and it's Litchfield Do, because they claim it's better to us. And the reason for that is Kakadu is huge, as you can see on here. Sort of place you'd go for a week or a few days to stay there and really see it. On the other hand, Litchfield National Park is very doable on a day trip out of Darwin, and it's got its own attractions. It's usually about a 2 hours drive south of Darwin, and the tours usually stop at a place called Bachelor. It's like a halfway trip down there. Litchfield covers about 1,400 square kilometres. It's not small by any means, but there's 2 main attractions in here. There's the magnetic termite mounds, and Wangi Falls, and most of the tours go down for this reason. Termite mounds are constructions, for want of a better word, made by the termites. And there's two types of mounds here. There's this what's known as cathedral mounds, and they grow incredibly high, as you can see the size of that woman standing there. And considering they are the work of tiny termites, they're quite amazing structures. What's equally amazing are what's known as tombstone mounds. These are very thin-edged mounds that pretty much all face the same direction, and they look like tombstones. And they're purposely built and aligned like this, believe it or not, by these termites. They're all facing north, south, and that's why they're called magnetic mounds. And they're built in this way so that the back is facing east or west, or something along those lines, which minimizes the exposure to the sun, keeping the termites inside cool. So they're quite clever to have worked this out by themselves. And if you consider the shapes of these mounds and the direction they face, it is quite a clever feat. Despite the shape of the mounds, they're all quite porous, obviously, with the holes for the termites to come and go. So this is not a real great idea, poking your finger in just to make sure that they're in there. Wangi Falls is the other popular attraction at Lichfield, and they're surrounded by this amazing lush rainforest. From time to time, there's a swimming hole here that's opened for, depending on the time of the year. There's a bit of a boardwalk up to this. It's got some quite beautiful photography from here. As I say, at certain times it's open at the base of the falls to walk, certain times it's not. And I think that largely depends on how much rain they've had coming down in the wet season before. A couple of years ago, they spent millions upgrading the visitor centre here. Most tours stop for lunch. I can't say it's going to be here, but generally speaking, it's at one of these. So we're heading on now. We're almost at the end of it now. The currency in Australia is the Australian dollar. And this is the only currency that's accepted here. You can't use American dollars or euros or anything like that. There are plenty of banks around, or ATM machines in malls and banks and convenience stores, one thing and another. If you want to try some local cuisine while you're in Darwin, this fish here is called barramundi. It's like, or barra for short, specialty of the region up here. Done in beer batter, it goes down very well with a nice cold beer, or a stubby, as it's called in Australia. And I suppose the colloquialism is to have a barra and a stubby. But in Darwin, that's not a stubby, that's a stubby. And that's an industrial strength Darwin stubby. It is very hot up here and, whatever. If you really want to try something a little bit more traditional, you can't go far wrong with a staple in any Australian pub. It's a chicken schnitzel, commonly known as a schnitty. But any place around the town. And there used to be a cafe here at the night market called the Roadkill Cafe. If you kill it, they'll grill it. But I think they since got closed down, but that was about. And the next bit is very important because Australia has very strict quarantine inspections, regulations here, on the entry borders, whether they by sea or by air. And we've come from Bali and Komodo, so if you've bought some carvings, you need just to bear this in mind. In according with Australian quarantine laws, you can't bring any food off the ship, any food at all, or plants, or untreated, dodgy-looking wood that might have insects in it. If you're diabetic and you need some sort of lolly, it's better you point it out to them before they find the food, because there are bins at the gangway, depending on the ship, sometimes at the gangway, differently on the pier, where you can drop off, have your half-eaten breakfast or plants or whatever else you've got that you shouldn't have taken ashore. Aquis uses highly trained sniffer dogs, and you're usually asked to drop your bag, put your bag or your rucksack down at ground level as you walk out so that the dogs can sniff. And these dogs can sniff a piece of breakfast a mile off, I got to tell you, and you will hear announcements going all day, especially on the bigger ships, because people will not come to my talk or not read the program and take food ashore. And as the morning wears on, Aquis get a little bit edgy about it, and we start hearing a lot of announcements. And they will say that if they find it, you'll be fined. So we find, you find. So just bear that in mind. The only drinks you can take off the ship is bottled water. And you definitely should be taking bottled water ashore with you because it's very hot up here. And you don't really want to be coming back to the ship in this condition here. So make sure you have water. You're allowed to take that off. Even if you're just walking around in the sun, you should be applying sun cream. This is Australia. We're very conscious of sun damage down here. We've all had bits and pieces cut off. My rule of thumb is, when my skin turns this color, it's probably time for me to get out of the sun. Hopefully it's not going to turn this color here. When you come back to the ship, you will pass through it will be hot, I can almost guarantee it. You pass through this covered area to get to quarantine at the end there. And every time I come to Darwin, every so many months, I keep hoping they've changed this. This has been like this forever. If you're having problems with stairs or you have a wheelchair, because you've got to go through there, they've got an X-ray machine, sometimes works, sometimes doesn't, but you need to go through and down the stairs at the other side. If you have a problem walking or you can't make those stairs or you're in a wheelchair, just mention to them, and I've seen them take the bags, X-ray the bags, pull that railing aside and let you walk through. So that's just a little tip if you're having problems. But I'm just reminding you, if you're carrying any of these things with you, rocket launchers, flamethrowers, bazookas, anything like that, you do need to declare them at this point. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for coming along to my tape today. I hope you have a wonderful time in Darwin. My next talk will be on whatever it is. I think it's cairns after that. Thank you and good afternoon.